When you play the Game of Thrones, you
subscribe and like,
or you die. There is no middle ground.
Let's talk about my general thoughts about A Game of Thrones. To me, A Game of Thrones is a book that is very similar to A Feast for Crows. It is a book that is really consistent in terms of the quality from chapter to chapter usually is at least at a baseline good or what you expect from A Song of Ice and Fire. There's no real, like, bad chapters in this book, in my opinion. Like, yes, there's some ones that I think are lower rated. Like, I think my lowest 2 rated chapters are Bran 3 and Arya 1. And the reasons is Arya 1's very short. It doesn't actually do a lot in terms of the story outside of kind of introducing us into Arya and Jon's relationship and a little bit of the Robb and Joffrey dynamic, as well as maybe like a Sansa-Arya dynamic as well. But it's one of those things where it's like, it feels like a chapter that, yes, is good to have, especially for, I think, the Robb and Jon, or not Robb and Jon, but Robb and Joffrey element of foreshadowing the events to come. But in terms of everything else, right, you know, Sansa and Arya, we get a lot throughout the book. This is one of those chapters that kind of feels like it's not as necessary as a lot of the chapters are in this book. And so that's why it's kind of, I think it's, for me, lower rated. And then also Bran 3. I feel like Bran 3 is just a weird chapter in this book that doesn't really fit. It's a very magical chapter in a book where there's almost no magic involved outside of maybe Jon's plotline. And it feels very disconnected from the storyline as well in terms of Bran in that chapter. And so I think, to me, outside of like those two maybe, I think all of the chapters in the Game of Thrones are pretty much just at that baseline, good, consistent quality. And so I compare it to Feast in that way, but Game of Thrones, to me, the reason I like it better than Feast, Game of Thrones hits higher heights than Feast does. And that's just kind of how it is, right? I think for me personally, Game of Thrones feels more structured like a traditional story, right? Where you're kind of building up the entire time, where Feast for Crows is, it stays at like a consistent level, but it has like little peaks here and there, right? So you'll have like the Kingsmoot peak. You'll have, you know, Ariane's POV, or first POV, that peak. You know, you'll have some Brienne stuff. Like, for Game of Thrones, it feels like you just are, the entire time, you're just going up on the roller coaster. The entire time. You're just going up. Because think about the last chapters in this book. I mean, they're some of the best, right? Whether that's, you know, Robb's King of the North, whether that's Daenerys, you know, bringing the dragons back into the world. Even for Sansa's plotline, I think her last chapter is, I don't know if it's her best of it, but it's arguably her best chapter. So you have a lot of like forward momentum. Arya's last chapter with Ned's death is one of the best chapters of the book. So you kind of go to this moment where A Game of Thrones, you're very much in a kind of upward trajectory, which is something I really like. It helps the pacing of A Game of Thrones. I think it's a really well-paced book in terms of there's not like a really long time without anything major happening, but there's also not this like Storm of Swords kind of has a different take of I think A Game of Thrones, where Storm of Swords is just, you're on a high the whole time because it's all the big moments paying off in the first 2 books. And this book, you don't really have that. Like, this book kind of takes its time with building up of big twists and things like that, like Ned's coup, for instance. That's a long build up. It feels really earned. And so I kind of want to then kind of shift over into like my strengths of the book. I think one of the biggest strengths of the book is consistency. There's not a couple stretch where there's a little bit of some maybe building or maybe more filler chapters. There's not a lot of that in this book, right? You're at a very consistent quality, and you very rarely go below that consistent quality, especially as you get further into the book. I think as you get further into the book, no plot line in the book has like an off chapter, for instance, right? You know, there's no, like, for me personally, I look at like Sam and Feast for Crows. I think Sam 3 and 4, I don't think are very good chapters in my opinion to read. They're very kind of boring in my opinion, and they don't really forward the plot too much. So like that is not the case in Game of Thrones. If you're going to look at, you know, some of the weaker parts of a Game of Thrones, it's going to be the very beginning, which makes sense because you're having to build out all these characters. You're having to build out all this plot line, all the lore. There's a lot that has to be established in a very little amount of time. And I think George handles that perfectly in this book, right? Where even the chapters where you feel like there's a lot of things being thrown at you, especially if you're a first-time reader or you're watching the show for the first time, the way George explains things makes it feel really easy to understand. So, like, for instance, we start really in the same place. We start in Winterfell. And so you don't see all these kind of, different plot lines branching out until, a good amount into the book, right? About maybe a quarter of the way through. And that's when you kind of see all these branching plot lines. Because at the very start of the book, it's really just everybody is kind of in Winterfell. And then you have Daenerys. Daenerys is the only isolated plot, really. And that's another strength of this book. I think Daenerys is a huge strength because she provides you kind of almost an escape from the politics and the corruptness that is Westeros, right? That is usually King's Landing, because Ned, throughout the first 3/4 of this book, he is in like one every 3 to 4 chapters. So you get a lot of Ned. Daenerys feels like a chapter which is kind of alleviating that, where it's kind of a lot more personal. It's about Daenerys's growth. It's about her dynamic with her brother, her integrating into this society and culture. So I really think that the pacing of the book is really good. Consistency is really good. The way that George is able to introduce us into this world is done perfectly. And he does it in such a natural way, right? Well, we'll have like Ned's first chapter is, him and Robert, and they're discussing, some things that happened in Robert's Rebellion that are key to understanding the events that we get to now. But then it'll come back right after that, and we'll get, Dany 1, and it'll be kind of the flip side of that history, right? We're getting a different perspective into what may have happened there with Viserys, telling Daenerys all these things and her thinking about them. I think, George plays with that a lot in this book, where Daenerys feels very connected to the main storyline in terms of other strengths. And some of my favorite moments of the book, when you have, for instance, Robert and Ned debating, should we kill Daenerys? And then you'll see the repercussions of that and the things that affected Daenerys' plot, in her chapters. So I really like the way that those are intertwined and they feel like, a break from one another. I really like the way those plot lines kind of intertwine. And of course, the story breaks into a bunch of different plot lines as we proceed through the story. Of course, as Bran is going to be the only one in Winterfell for the back half of the book, as he's kind of, our POV into Robb until Robb leaves. You have Catelyn's plot where she's all over the place, whether it's in the Vale, whether it's in the North at the beginning, whether it's at King's Landing for a chapter. She's just all everywhere in this book. You have Tyrion, with Jon, and those two I think are very similar in this book in terms of there's a lot of growing on, and they're kind of the two that feel like they're not outside of Bran, because Bran is the slowest POV to get going. Jon and Tyrion feel like the two that take the longest to get going. And when they finally get going, they're really great, but they definitely do feel like the kind of the slower POVs as you're building up into them. So more of my strengths, I will say, I think the last quarter of this book is some of the best writing George has done in terms of the conclusions of these characters. Because we take every character, and every character outside of, I think Sansa is the only character where I feel like their conclusion wraps up where the character has been going in this adventure from the first page to the end. Sansa's the only one where it's like, it doesn't feel as concluded. And what do I mean by that? So let me give you guys some examples. Tyrion starts out the book as kind of just a Lannister who doesn't really seem to have a place. He's the witty Lannister, all these things, but he's overlooked because of Jaime and Cersei and all these things. And so, he's going to the Wall, he's going on this adventure, he's put into captivity of crimes that he didn't commit. It's him using his intellect and his, charisma to, get out of that situation and then get the mountain clans on his side. And even, that dynamic with his own father, right? Because that also is part of the first book as well. That builds it up, because we're not going to see Tywin with Tyrion, in the second book. So that has to kind of be built up here. So you're seeing that relationship and how Tywin manipulates every single thing, even his family members, right? He even takes Tyrion, who Tyrion realizes, yeah, my father tried to have me killed, basically putting me in the vanguard. And so you see that where Tyrion finds his position, where he's going to be going for this story, where he's going to become Hand of the King in the next book. And so that relationship with Tyrion and Tywin seems very interesting now, because Tywin feels as though Tyrion is really all he has left. Jaime has been taken a prisoner, so he has no heir, right? And that's a really interesting idea. Like, what would, Tywin do if Jaime was killed? We just don't know. So part of that is interesting, because by the time you get to the end of Tyrion, you're like, yeah, this feels like a earned plot line where when we get into the next book, we're going to see a lot of different development with Tyrion, putting him in a different position, using kind of with skills we've developed in the first book that we've seen from Tyrion, taking that to King's Landing, where we just saw that Ned struggled to do that. And it's so interesting because we look at Ned and Tyrion are quite the opposite. They're almost polar opposite characters almost. And so you're sitting here going, okay, well, how is Tyrion, a character we like, going to then do in King's Landing, given what we know of him as a character? Feels like a very good conclusion to the character. Jon, for instance. Jon is very similar to Tyrion in a lot of ways. Jon is someone that doesn't feel like he has a place, right? He's a bastard, and those are viewed horribly in Westeros, and he's in this position where he doesn't know what to do, right? And so he feels like, he's not wanted at Winterfell because of Catelyn. And so he wants to go to the Watch because he believes that's a very honorable thing. The Starks do that all the time. And that's not really the true thing, right? The Wall is where a lot of criminals go. It's kind of like it's not your death sentence, but it's like your life sentence, more or less, if you're going to get that, to go to jail or something like that. And so Jon, it's him kind of feeling divided because, yes, he has these family interests where, he does care about his father. He does care about his brother, his sisters, all of these things. And so it's him, feeling like, yes, the Wall is a place where he can, gain respect and honor and a place in the world. It's him struggling with that idea, but then also, this attachment that he has with his family. It's like the same idea if you look at the idea of Anakin in Star Wars, where Anakin has an attachment to his mother, and that's something that the Jedi don't like, because that may sway him to do something for his mother over what the Jedi want. It's the same idea here with the Night's Watch and Jon. And we see that put to the test, but we also see the threat of the others coming up as well in this book. And so by the end of it, Jon is pretty much backed into a corner, and he has to figure out what he's going to do. And he becomes a Night's Watchman. They're going to go north of the Wall. And given what we saw in the first chapter of the book, that's quite an interesting way to put, to take Jon's character, right? Putting him right into the danger of book 2. So again, you feel those natural endpoints for these characters in this book, even for, I think, the lower, I guess more of the middle POVs of the book, right? Tyrion and Jon are definitely like the middle POVs. I think the lower two are definitely Sansa and Bran, and then it's like Tyrion and Jon are kind of in that middle ground. So I think that's a major strength of this book. It really takes our characters on a compelling journey where they have a fitting end, where I can't always say that depending on what book we're talking about. Another strength that we're going to talk about a lot is going to be themes. I think the themes of this book are very strong. They're very apparent. They're kind of in your face, what this world is about. And we'll talk about those later on. Now, I don't think a Game of Thrones has a lot of weaknesses personally, but I did want to list some things that I did kind of pick up on and that were maybe some issues here and there, but I don't know. So this book to me can take a little while to get going. Like I talked about, there is a lot of stuff that needs to be established, right? There's a lot of world building that needs to be established, a lot of introduction into characters and names. And so I feel like this is more of an issue on a reread than it is your main, like, first time reading the book, is that it does take the story a bit of time to get going, and that's just natural, right? That's how I feel like every single first book is always going to be, for the most part, is you're going to start out a little slow. You've just got to introduce us into this massive world. George R. R. Martin has one of the biggest world with the most amount of house names and characters within those houses, and what regions of the world they're in, and what do all these places stand for. What are they good or bad? Should we be reviewing them like the Starks, who are the good guys, or should we be viewing them as like the Lannisters, who are the bad guys? A lot of stuff has got to be built up and not a lot of time. And so sometimes I feel like Early on in the book, you can get maybe a little bit where it might feel a little slower on a reread specifically. At other times, and I think this is definitely leans on Bran when I was talking about that, but Bran is a POV that's very underwhelming for the first half of the book. I talked about this at length. Bran is almost not a character until like his 4th POV chapter. Like, think about that. It takes like 4 POV chapters to really have some actual development for the character of Bran. I don't know if like that's a hot take. People might disagree with how I view the character of Bran in this book, but to me, it really takes a while for him to get going. What do we know about Bran in terms of the first like 3 chapters? So the first chapter is not really about Bran. It's about introducing us into Ned, introducing us into Jon and Robb and their rivalry, but also their brotherly love, because they are 2 of the main characters of the story at this point. You know, finding the wolves. There's not really a lot of time to develop Bran necessarily. All we know about Bran is he's somebody that is a lesser son of this major lord, and he's, you know, being groomed to rule, or to eventually rule somewhere. That's all we know about Bran, really, in the first chapter. The second chapter rolls by. Okay, we know that Bran likes to climb, and he wants to be a knight. You know, he wants to maybe train with Barristan Selmy. And then the second chapter is about really introducing us into this idea of Jaime and Cersei's relationship, that reveal, and also Bran's fall, which has a lot of impact on other characters, as well as Bran himself. Bran 3 is a dream. So it's all about kind of starting us into this magic, you know, idea where we're going to go with Bran. But that doesn't pay off in this book, really. That doesn't really start to come to fruition. We don't see Bran actually getting any type of answers about what that means or anything about it until the next book. So it's one of those books, or it's one of those chapters where I think would have been better in another chapter, but I get why it was here. It just doesn't feel like it naturally fits into the story. But then we get to Bran 4. And so Bran 4 is where we see a lot more of the character of Bran and his you know, his dreams. We see him being more, you know, feeling not great because he wanted to be a knight. And how is he going to do that? Because now he's, you know, disabled. You know, he can't use his legs. And his dynamic with his brother Robb. It really starts to get the ball moving for Bran. But by the time that happens, I mean, we're about at least halfway through the book by the time Bran really starts to pick up for me, before we see anything really come out of Bran. So that would be one of my big things for a Game of Thrones, is that, you know, the Bran character specifically takes a bit of time to get going. Now, this is another weakness that I think is not just to this book, and I actually think of all of the books, this one, it might be the least bit of a problem. But again, I just have this problem with George R.R. Martin's writing. He likes to write sex very weirdly. Like, you would think if you're writing this, right, you know, you just say they have sex and move on, right? It's not that big of a point of this, right? Or, you know, all these things. But the way he writes them are just so weird. Like, Daenerys's first, like, encounter with Drogo in Daenerys 2, I believe, is just very weird and, like, uncomfortable. It's very uncomfortable to read. Because it's like Daenerys is very young, and the way it's just described is weird. So that's just another weakness. Like, you just get, that's just one of the things with being a Song of Ice and Fire fan, is that George writes sex really weird. I don't know why, but he just does, and it makes me uncomfortable. I don't know. I mean, do you guys agree? Do you guys agree? I don't know. I did not care for Bran chapters. I like Bran's chapters in the second half of the book. I don't like Bran chapters at the beginning. Like, I like Bran 1, but I don't like it because of Bran. That's my problem with Bran. Bran is not an interesting POV until, like, his 4th chapter. Let's talk about some of the themes of the book. I wanted to go with some of the major ones right away for this book. There's some that are just right in your face. Love and duty. This one pretty much affects pretty much every single plot line. As every single plot line, there is usually a conflict between your love for your family or love for another person or whatnot. It's always set to the test against your duty. So, for instance, there is major ones like what Eamon tells John, right? Should he stay in the watch or should he, go help his family? That's the one that's put in your face where this theme comes from. But I want to do some even more minor ones. Think about Sansa and her relationship with Joffrey, right? Where she's put, duty between love, right? Because duty would be, okay, you should stand up for your sister and you should say that Joffrey is lying. But the love kind of blinds from that. But also, at the same time, if you think about it, there is duty in staying loyal to the prince you're betrothed to as well. So you have interesting things like that, right? You think about, for instance, Ned and his decision about what he should do with the whole Joffrey thing, right? Should he, lie, right? And that will protect for the love of Sansa, but that also denies his duty. His duty is to say that Joffrey is a bastard and all these things. So there, you have another point of it there. Tyrion, love and duty once again. He has a love for Shay, but his duty, Tywin tells him not to bring Shay to court. What does he do? I know that's a Clash of Kings thing, but he does confirm he's going to do it in this book. It's riddled throughout the entire story. The entire story. You think about Catelyn. This is Catelyn's pretty much her main theme, pretty much the entire story. So it's just riddled everywhere out through the story. I don't want to talk too long on it because it's just kind of the most baseline one you could do, but it is probably the most popular one in the book. I would say the second one, and this is probably the other one that kind of is up there, is identification. And I think this one specifically is about identification, just because it is the first book. Think about how many young characters we have that don't know what they're going to be, or, they have to rediscover themselves, or all those things. Even the characters that are older, right, that we have, like Tyrion, Catelyn, and Ned, all of them are kind of like, they have their things identified, like what values they have, but those are then immediately put to the test in the book. And so everything is about identification. How do you identify, right? Daenerys, she starts out as this shy girl who doesn't stand up for herself, who's being abused by her brother, and by the end of it, she's a very strong-willed, someone that's had to take on the entire mantle of the Targaryens. She is very confident by the end of the story. You think about a character like Robb. Robb goes from being just a young teenager kid to having to become the king of the North, having to win a war, right? Winning battles and stuff like that, whether it be the Battle of the Camps or the Battle of the Whispering Wood, having to grow up as an individual, right? We see him in Bran 4 breaking down with his brother, but then by the end of the story, he seems like a stoic man now, changed from the beginning of the book. Jon, like I talked about already, his journey from the start to the end. Identification is a huge part of this book. And it's not as big of a theme as it is in this book that it is in, like, the next two. The next two aren't nearly as much about, like, characters trying to find their purpose and things like that. That's what mainly this book's about. But, yeah. But also, I kind of hinted about this theme as well. Morals and ethics put to the test. Like, how much can you be pushed before, or how desperate you have to become before you start to change your own belief system and the ways you've been taught. Arya has a great, like, moment of this. I know she's not, an older character, but it takes her values where she's told not to steal. But when you are, hungry, when you need to eat and you can't buy anything, you don't have money, at what point is it okay to steal? How do you rationalize stealing? For instance, Ned, right? His ethics, like I talked about already, him then setting aside his duty and his honor and his pride and all these things so that he can potentially, save Sansa and all these different people. That's present throughout the entire story, right, of ethics, and when do you break what you believe in. Another pretty clear one that's in here, it's not as clear in this book as it is in, I think, the next two books especially, even, really, I'd say the rest of the whole series, really, but anti-war theme, it really comes up in this book specifically, in terms of, okay, you see Daenerys, right, where she wants to go to Westeros, she wants to take over, her father's throne. Well, to do that, Khal Drogo has to, attack right? He has to go to war to be able to build up the gold and to get these boats to then sail to Westeros. What does that cause? Well, it causes the suffering of all these people that Drogo has to conquer, right? You know, whether that's them, you know, killing innocents, whether it's, you know, taking people's slaves, misusing women, all those things come to the forefront. You know, think about Catelyn. Her whole argument during the King of the North chapter is shouldn't go to war because all these people are going to die. You're going to lose more sons. You're going to lose more family, all these things. You're not going to be able to get those things back. Revenge is not going to, you know, fix that. Revenge is also another theme. I didn't have it written down, but that's also one. You know, you have Tyrion during the Battle of the Green Fork, and he's seeing the horror of a battle from someone that's not very skilled, which it would be very similar to like one of these peasants that has never held a sword in their life, right? Having to go into a battle, showing the horror of those things, right? So that's definitely one that's at the forefront of the book. The greater good. I think this is a really one that I'm interested in for this book, and it really pops up in a couple major ways, but one of them being, what is the greater good in terms of Daenerys, right? Robert tries to argue, well, if we kill Daenerys now and we kill her child, we kill Viserys, there will never be any Targaryen rebellions, right? Just like how the Blackfire Rebellions thing was an issue for the Targaryens for many years. What about, you know, Daenerys, right? If there's a Targaryen line, there will always be a chance of them coming over and having tons of warfare. And we even know that Robert's right? In terms of Robert, Daenerys is going to come over with 3 dragons, or at least 2, at least 1, however many dragons. She's probably going to have 3 if I had to guess. She's going to have Unsullied, Dothraki, you know, sellswords, whatever. That's going to probably take over Westeros. It's going to cause thousands to probably die. So in a way, we as a reader, with the hindsight of the knowledge that we know, Robert isn't wrong in terms of what's going to happen, his actual outcome. But we also then see Ned's argument, which Ned's argument is, okay, put all that aside. You're killing an innocent woman. You're killing an innocent baby. Or you're killing innocents. Like, is that ever justified? And the answer is no. But you understand where Robert's coming from as well. So you have this interesting idea of what is the greater good, right? And that's what's great about George's writing. It's why I really love that chapter. It's why I have it ranked so highly, is because it puts you in the situation of Ned or Robert and says, what would you do in this situation? What would you do, right? And Ned is one of those people that is steadfast behind his beliefs, something that not many people, especially in this world, can do. So I really like that. It's one of my favorite themes of the book. Another great theme of this book that is very central with Daenerys' plot is, what is life, right? Like, what is life worth? Trying to go through this huge philosophical issue of what does life mean? And, you know, we hear Miri's take of it, where, you know, what's life left when everyone you know is either enslaved or dead? What's life worth when you've been used and abused? What's life worth when everything's gone that you know and loved? When you've been reduced to, you know, a slave and being beaten and being called a witch and all these things. It's great because it tells you in a lot of ways you should be thankful for what you have, right? You know, the things that you experience, whether it's your family, whether it's your friends, whether it's, you know, the ability to be able to do a YouTube live show. I like that theme as well. I think it really is a central part of Daenerys' arc. And what makes Miri so interesting is because Miri, in a lot of ways, is a villain because Daenerys is supposed to be the hero. But at the same time, you can really understand Miri as a character as well. It goes back to the same idea of like Ned and Robert. You can see, if you were put into Miri's shoes, why she does these things. Because it comes down to greater good again. Miri thinks that, okay, if she, you know, puts the Khal Drogo as this, you know, vegetable state, and she kills Daenerys' child, there will be no more, you know, Dothraki raiding all these cities and things like that, which isn't true. We know that's not true. They're just going to find some other leader. But I think really good theme of the book. Another one that's pretty central to the book as well, and mainly through, I would say, Ned's POV, but trust, right? Trusting, who do you trust, right? In terms of like, okay, if you're in a place like King's Landing, can you trust anyone, right? Littlefinger is someone that suggests you should trust no one, but if you trust no one, you means you have no friends. And that's not a great life if you're telling yourself that you can only trust people because you've paid them. It's not a good way to live your life, right? And so you see that that is also kind of one of the central themes of the King's Landing plot, pretty much going through the entire series. But it was something that I think should have been brought up here. Another one I thought was interesting is parenting / family issues. Think about the way parenting has such a huge effect on younger characters specifically, right? Think about how that impacts Daenerys, right? Everything Daenerys knows is from her brother. She didn't really have parents, right? Think about Robb, the way he is kind of Ned. And same thing with Jon as well. They really take after Ned because of that's how they were parented. It really goes into this idea that you as an individual, you may not like this. You may see there's flaws in your parents or may not even like your parents, but you are a product in a lot of ways, the way you grew up, the way you were taught, what values you were taught. And yes, you can develop as a person, of course, and you can change what you believe in and all these things. But when it boils down to it, you have a lot of traits of your parents and the circumstances that you grew up in. And so a lot of that is very present here in terms of, looking at Sansa, right? She's very much taking after kind of her mother. We see Arya kind of taking after Ned in a lot of ways. We see, Bran trying to already, the first like Bran chapter, the second chapter of the book is all about, Bran learning these lessons from his father so that he can do the same when he grows up. All of that's a huge part of this. Even the family issues in terms of like Lysa and Catelyn, their dynamic, the issues that's going to cause, right? The issues between Lysa and her father and the road that led them down. It's a very central theme to the story. Littlefinger and Catelyn's, relationship, however weird it was, or it seems it was, big part of the story. Another one that I don't see many people talk about this being a theme for Game of Thrones, but disability. I think it's actually a very important theme in this book that, George kind of paints at. People treat people with disabilities very differently, but those people are still, human beings. Bran not having his legs, having to be lugged around by Hodor. And there's multiple times in this book where people look at him differently, laughing or having pity on him, or, we hear other people not really in Bran's presence that they would have rather killed Bran than let him live, living like that, which is just insane. It kind of translates to disabilities that we see, in the real life, not just in physical disabilities, but all types of disabilities where, people will treat those people badly for what reasons? Because they're different. I thought that was a really nice theme that George put in here. It's also present with Tyrion because Tyrion is almost a byproduct of that, right? Having mismatched eyes, he's shorter. He is quite literally the exact opposite of his brother Jaime in terms of appearance and all those things. And people make fun of him for that just because he's shorter than people. Like, massive theme of a Game of Thrones. I enjoy that George, does bring that up because it is a real world issue. I did a presentation or project, not last semester, but the semester before, on the actual idea of disability. And I think it's an interesting topic, given how we treat it, but yeah. Another couple ones which are pretty, I think, obviously they're kind of put there right in front of you. Power, of course. Everybody's clamoring for power in terms of King's Landing specifically. The way people will switch up on other people because of the idea of who has power, who can get you more power. I think that's a big one, especially with like power and greed. I think greed's another one. Think about Walder Frey. Him, needing power. Like, which side gains him more power? Going with Tywin, going with Robb in this book. He ends up going with Robb because that means eventually he can get his daughter or his granddaughter, whatever, married to Robb, ties him in with a really big family and gains him a lot of power. Also, the Freys just in general, they make you pay these big tolls. In a lot of ways, it's a lot of greed. you know, it's there. Consequence is another one, but that one's pretty self-explanatory. I mean, what actions you do in this story have repercussions. They have consequences. A lot of things that I think modern storytelling, especially in movies and shows, has really failed to do. If a character makes a mistake, there should be ramifications to making that mistake. You know, Sansa is in love with Joffrey and does all these things for him, and that has a consequence. You know, now she's trapped in King's Landing. She's trapped with Joffrey and being tormented by him. You know, and that's not to say that Sansa deserves those things, but there's a consequence to what happened. There's a direct result, a correlation, what happens from this thing to this thing. You know, Ned is the big one, right? He makes, you know, a bad move to stay in King's Landing after Robert dies, and that leads to his death. So, yeah. Corruption kind of goes along with what we've been talking about this whole time. And that gets me through most of my main themes. If you guys have any other ones, let me know in the chat. But yeah. I wanted to go through a couple of my favorite moments of the book, and then we'll kind of wrap up my conclusion, more or less. But I think for me, of course, you've got to say one of the favorite moments of the book is, or not maybe favorite, but I think some of the best moments, most memorable moments of book one. You got to go to Ned's death and also Ned's coup. I think everything leading up to Ned's coup and also the coup itself, plus Ned's death, just highlights of the book. I mean, you're just putting everything that Ned believes in to the test. And you're watching as the fan favorite character not only loses, but also dies in a matter of you know, like, I think it's like 100, maybe 200 pages is the time frame in which he, you know, the coup happens and he dies. So definitely a highlight. One of the best parts of the book for me personally, even though it's very sad. A little part of me died when Ned died, because, you know, when you spend so long with a character, and especially one like Ned, where, like I talked about, Ned is a character I was covering at least once a month for probably 15 months straight. Or no, probably longer than that, like probably 16, 17 months straight. When you're going in so in depth with the psychology of a character, when they're just all of a sudden they die, it's like, wow. And I can't even imagine once we get to the Red Wedding, because that one's going to be even tougher given Catelyn and how long I will have been, you know, in-depthly covering the character for so long. That'll be probably 5 years into doing, you know, rereads. But yeah, definitely a big moment of the first book. I would say Daenerys 5 and 10, which is Viserys' death, and then also the rebirth of the dragons, which, yeah, they're Daenerys' best 2 chapters. Her dynamic with Viserys is super compelling in the first 5 chapters of the book. I really enjoyed their dynamic. I think Viserys is one of my favorite characters in terms of best written. I think Viserys is just really well written. I really enjoyed doing a character analysis of the character, which I was inspired to do because of my reread early on when I was doing it. I love the way, you know, that twisted end that Viserys gets and the poetic end. And then also just, yeah, the rebirth of the dragons is just everything that's led up to Daenerys, right? As she's getting these dragon dreams throughout the book, and she slowly is getting pushed more and more into desperation and, you know, finding herself, not being able to look back. She says that to herself a lot in the last couple chapters. And she brings dragons back to the world, something that hadn't been seen for a long time and was thought to be impossible. And she does it. So, yeah. I think, again, we talked about this one already, so I won't talk on this one too much, but Ned and Robert's debate on whether to kill Daenerys, again, it puts 2 different ideologies to the test for this idea of the greater good. Should they kill Daenerys, which could be a possible threat in the future? Should they not, because she's just an innocence? I really enjoyed Jon's talk with Aemon about the idea of love and duty and honor and how those things conflict each other, why you take the vow to not have a wife, to not have children, all those things. Again, it highlights the main central theme of the book. It's definitely one of the highlights of the book. The Battle of the Green Fork, which, I mean, this chapter, it's just a fantastic chapter. It might be, I think, the longest chapter of the book, but it doesn't feel it, right? The pacing of building up to this battle that's coming and all of this, even though we know Robb isn't sending his full force to the Battle of the Green Fork, at the same time, it still feels gut-wrenching because we don't know what's going to happen to Tyrion, right? We don't know what's going to happen. Tyrion's in the thick of the danger. He could possibly die here. And we've kind of started to get really, involved with the character of Tyrion. He's just started getting going. And so having him go through this battle, which is horrifying, Tyrion himself is not a good fighter. It's a just really well-paced chapter. It really gets the conflict of the War of the Five Kings going, and it's definitely a good one. Robb becoming king, how can you not have this a highlight of the chapter, or the book, is just one of my favorite chapters. The King of the North, the way we're looking at this, and it's like, yes, it's this heroic moment where Robb has become the king. He's gained all this respect from all these people, the growth of the character from his first chapter in Bran 1 to all the way to now in this epic, speech by the great Jon and being declared as the King of the North. But at the same time, especially on a reread, this gets even more enhanced because you love the moment, but you're also sitting there going, this is not a good decision. This is a very bad decision. You're sitting here, you're going, this is basically when the North loses the war. Right then and there. This is a huge, monumental mistake. You're sitting there going, okay, your first reread, you're with, Robb, and you're like, yeah, we gotta teach those Lannisters a lesson, we gotta keep going to war. The second time you read it, you're going, yeah, I'm kind of with Catelyn on this. I don't think we should get involved in all these innocents being killed and all this stuff. I think just make a peace. That's called character growth from the reader. But yeah. I also found another very underrated moment. And this is not one that I think stands out. It's one you can easily kind of forget. I think Robb and Bran, when they're talking, by themselves, they're alone. It's right after Catelyn's left, and Robb has to become the Lord. He's basically become Robb the Lord in Bran's eyes. And we see that vulnerable side of Robb as, he kind of breaks down, and him and Bran hug. It's a beautiful, beautiful moment to me, especially because where these two characters are going to go. They're never going to, well, at this point, there are still chapters going forward, but these characters are not going to see each other again. It just hits all the more hard. It's just, Bran finally has started to become more of a character, and seeing Robb, who's a character we've watched from other POVs, and, his growth, struggling with becoming that Lord, because he's so young. He shouldn't have been put in this position, like Eris in the chat. He shouldn't have been in this position in the first place, but he had to rise to the occasion. So, I really love that moment. I think it's an underrated moment. And I think another one that I think is underrated, Arya's escape from the Red Keep, right? Taking everything that Arya knows, from her lessons with Syrio, how to get around places, using, her street smarts and all that stuff to evade capture. I think really sums up Arya's character really well in this book. But yeah, so those are all my big moments. To kind of conclude about the book, I think it is a book that only gets better the more you reread it, because so many things have more layers as you kind of think about what happens afterwards, and you think about the decisions the characters are making in the moment. So I really find that this book is a great start to the series. It has everything that you want it to be, being a mystery drama over, how Jon Arryn died and what he died for. It's a great book of, the young having to grow up earlier than they needed to, or they're supposed to, and how that impacts them. I really enjoyed this book. This is kind of the conclusion of it. It's not the last time I'm going to talk about it. I still got to record off-screen my chapter rankings, because I was going to do that on stream, but that was going to take way too long. I have to rank 73 chapters, and I have to talk about them at least a little bit to explain why they're there, so that was going to take way too long. But yeah, thank you guys for joining me on my conclusion.